DawgNation. Good morning, DawgNation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Brayden Pest Management. I was a little bit of a salty mood yesterday, for whatever reason. Sometimes you are. Feel like I'm in a great mood today. Really excited about the show. We now know who Georgia is taking with it to SEC Media Days. And I love this stuff. You know, I've been doing this for a long time now. It's just as fun for me as it ever was. I get that little tingle about, I'm not even like the biggest Media Days fan in a lot of ways, to be totally honest. But I do love that Media Day signifies that fall camp's about to be here, season's going to be starting, high school football is going to be going. Like, we're just basically at the football season as far as I'm concerned. You know, I'm done with vacation, just kind of ready to go. And I think today we have a lot to talk about as it relates to that. You know, I'll also say that I think what Georgia selected, the three-player representatives that Kirby Smart has picked to be the spokesman for this team, I think it kind of sends a little bit of a revealing message. I'm going to try to explain why I think that's true. We've also got a couple of interesting recruiting notes for you on today's show. Mike Griffith stops by. Haven't talked to Mike here in a little while. And there are some SEC coaches in the hot seat, which we love laughing about. So we like doing that because Kirby Smart's basically the one that put them there. So we'll get into all of that here coming up. Fun show on tap. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Brayden Pest Management. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Brayden Pest Management. They handle bugs and critters.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
There is a thing we've kind of gotten used to seeing on the internet every year. And, you know, it's different now because, like, Dennis Dodd, the guy from CBS Sports, used to be the one that writes it. Now he doesn't. He's retired. But it's the hot seat rankings from CBS Sports. We're actually going to get into this a little bit later on about the SEC coaches who are sort of fighting for their jobs here in 2025. To be honest, that's a fun discussion for us because a lot of these coaches sort of fighting for their jobs, seeing themselves in the hot seat. Kirby Smart's sort of the one that put them there, so that's kind of funny to us. We'll get to that here coming up in just a little bit. But as far as like the Kirby Smart part of all this, you're not surprised to know that Smart is like the least hottest seat in all of college football, according to CBS Sports and their rankings. He is essentially, as they describe, untouchable. And we did some of this last week on the show about, you know, Smart's kind of going into year 10. He's not the young coach, hungry to prove what he's all about, ambition on full display, although I think he's just as ambitious as he ever was. That's not the defining characteristic of Kirby Smart. That Smart is, he's not an old man, but he is kind of becoming college football's version of an elder statesman. He is a coach very much in the prime of his career with some experience now. And I think the key defining characteristic of Kirby Smart, if he's not on the hot seat and if he's not fighting for his job, the other side of that is, I don't know that there's any program in college football more stable than Georgia's is, with a coach in a more stable situation than what Kirby Smart finds himself in. And as we've said before, this is not the thing that I think Georgia fans should take for granted, nor do I think they do take this for granted, because we have endured a lot of imposed chaos on college football in the last few years. And a lot of this, I think, was for the purpose of taking coaches like Kirby Smart, just seeing, you know, can we shake these guys from their foundation? Can we relinquish the stranglehold they have had on the sport? And at Georgia, whatever intent was kind of sort of professed by all of that just hasn't really worked. Georgia's still right there producing an elite recruiting class the way it kind of always expected to. Georgia is going to be, when the preseason rankings come out later on this summer, once again kind of right there in the top 5. This is a very stable program with the most stable head coach in all of college football for the upcoming season. That's the defining characteristic of Georgia. Now, the flip side of that is, and we had Bill Bender from the Sporting News on yesterday, he even kind of made reference to this. The inevitability of Georgia is so unquestioned, therefore a lot of media types, like Bender acknowledged yesterday, a lot of media types then just don't talk about Georgia at all. that they've just sort of become part of the furniture. Of course, Georgia's going to be a top 5 team. Of course, they're going to have a top 5 recruiting class. Of course, they're going to be near the top in the important categories. So therefore, let's move past Georgia and let's look at something more interesting. And sometimes that kind of gets on Georgia fans' nerves a little bit. Why can't we be more a prevalent part of the offseason conversation? But the extent to which it's not happening, we would say, is probably for a good reason, because there's, I would think, for the most part, very little to question for Georgia. They may or may not win the national championship, but they are going to be, as the season progresses, obviously a part of the national conversation. They are going to have their chance to do that, and we're going to watch that play out. Now, the reason why I say all of that here today is simply this, because yesterday Georgia indicated who its spokesman will be next week, SEC Media Days here in Atlanta. Obviously, DawgNation gearing up for huge coverage of all of that. And I think there was a lot that was very revealing about the trio of players that Georgia selected, even though the trio of players that Georgia selected, at least 2 of the 3, were pretty easy to predict. I still think there's a revealing message in all of this. So let me kind of roll through this in kind of ascending order of perhaps what's the most interesting about this, starting with the linebacker C.J. Allen. Now, as someone who has now been doing the sort of sports talk game for, I guess 20 years, from the time I was very young until now. Been around the sports talk game for a while. Let me tell you something I have observed about football as someone who has sort of spoken with fans and on behalf of fans in shows like this for a very long time. I think there's a big difference between the way in which oftentimes fans view football and teams, whether it be an NFL team or a college team, the way it views itself and its sort of spot within football. In other words, what fans want sometimes is they want you to work on your weaknesses. They want you to sort of solve your biggest problems. And to fans, oftentimes, that's the recipe for success. That's the pathway to how you get to a better spot than you've been before. That's what fans sort of want, whether it be through recruiting for a college team or the draft for an NFL team. They want to see you fix your weaknesses. I would say the teams themselves, both at the college and the NFL level, go about this a little bit different way. I think one of the most important pillars of their thought about themselves is we want to make sure our strengths stay strong. Not to say they don't want to fix their weaknesses, but in the mind of the organizational leaders of both college and pro football, we want to make sure our strengths stay strong. So when a guy like C.J. Allen, linebacker for Georgia, is going to SEC Media Days next week, this is the statement I think this ought to make to all of us who cares about Georgia football, that for 2025, one of Georgia's biggest strengths previously is expected to remain strong for this upcoming season. Since 2017, Georgia has had 3 Butkus Award-winning linebackers. It would not be a huge stretch for C.J. Allen to become the 4th. Now, Allen also plays a part of a very deep linebacking core where even the backups could be stars other places, and they perhaps will also be stars at Georgia. But Allen right now getting the most attention. Allen right now is one of the best players in the country, and he represents a continuation of one of Georgia's biggest strengths remaining strong for the upcoming season. That, I believe, is the revealing message about C.J. Allen being selected for SEC Media Days next week. When you look at Dalen Everett, the cornerback who's going next week, I think this is also an example of what Georgia's hopes for this upcoming season are pinned on. We talked about this the other day, that right now, if you look at a lot of these player rankings to begin the season, we cited Pro Football Focus on Monday, top 50 players to begin the year. Georgia only had 1 player on that list. Here's what we know. If Georgia finishes the year with only 1 of the top 50 or top 100 players in college football, then this has obviously likely been a disappointing season for Georgia. Nothing wrong with having, a small number of recognized elite names to begin a year, but clearly if you've only got a small number of those names, once the season's played out, then you've probably gone 9-3, 8-4. You've probably missed the college football playoff. So therefore, Georgia's fortunes this season in many ways are going to hinge on some kind of sort of swing players. There are some kind of hinge players, some swing points for Georgia where if this guy fully materializes, then the team itself probably rises because of that. There may be no greater example of this than Dalen Everett. Everett really came on last season, so much so that by the end of the year in the SEC championship win against Texas, he was the MVP of the game. And by coming back to Georgia after his growth a year ago, he sort of sets himself up as the kind of thing that sort of typically works in the SEC. We think about cornerbacks as these sort of young, exciting players. And obviously Georgia's got some of those like DeMello Jones or Ellis Robinson. But this is also a cerebral position. This is also a position where you've got to know a lot. And knowledge typically comes through experience. And so the fact that Everett, who's kind of the seasoned veteran in that cornerback position now coming back, the fact that he is being tabbed as one of the SEC Media Day spokesmen for Georgia next week, once again sort of signals of that group of players for Georgia that need to be on the rise, that could be on the rise, that could sort of put themselves in the forefront of the conversation of best players in the country by the end of the season. A guy who could be a high NFL draft pick, a guy who could be all SEC, a guy who could just simply be one of the best players in America. Everett's one of those guys that it's probably not wrong that he's not listed there now. It's not necessarily a slight to him or some sort of, bulletin board material for the program. But if we're thinking about guys that we know more about than the national media does, guys who could be there by the end of the year that are not there now, Everett, to me, is a prime example of that, and the fact that he'll be at Georgia at SEC Media Days next week. I think that's pretty revealing and perhaps a comforting message for Georgia fans who are kind of wondering who are the next big stars and key leaders for this program. Kirby's selection of Everett suggests that he is likely to be one of those guys. Now, all of that said, it brings us to this. It was really interesting yesterday to find out that Georgia quarterback Gunner Stockton is coming with the Dawgs to SEC Media Days. And this is one of those things you sort of have to understand the backstory on this to sort of get why this is meaningful. Obviously, there are a lot of quarterbacks this year coming to Media Days. I think it's a total of 11, but not every presumed starting quarterback is coming with his team. For instance, Ty Simpson not coming with Alabama, but Gunner Stockton is coming with Georgia. And this is one of those things that throughout the years, Smart's sort of done this sometimes, and sometimes he hasn't. For instance, in 2023, and I'm not picking on the guy, it's not necessarily a disparaging comment, I'm just pointing out that when Carson Beck had been traveling a similar pathway to what Gunner's traveling right now, kind of coming from the ranks of having been in the program for a little while, now set to step up and be the starter. In that particular year, Beck was not selected to go with Georgia to SEC Media Days. Sometimes Kirby Smart does take a quarterback. Sometimes he doesn't. In 2023, Beck wasn't selected. This year, the fact that Gunner Stockton is selected and going, I do think this speaks to the confidence that Kirby Smart has in Gunner Stockton. I do. I think that speaks to that confidence. It doesn't guarantee how Stockton will play this season, but I do think it sort of represents confidence that Kirby has to begin this year, and I think you ought to notice it. And we had kind of a fun conversation about this on the show yesterday, late in the program. We had the great former Georgia quarterback, a former SEC Media Days representative for the Dawgs, Jake Fromm, on the show, and we were talking about Gunner Stockton. And the point that Jake brought up is that not only does Kirby probably have some quiet confidence in Stockton, the fact that he is bringing Gunner to SEC Media Days may also be a reflection, as Jake alluded to yesterday, before the Stockton news came out, of course, as Jake alluded to yesterday, that maybe Kirby sort of secretly likes the fact that other folks maybe are kind of doubting Gunner more than Kirby thinks they should. This was really interesting from Jake Fromm yesterday. Take a listen to this.
As you're going into this, Brandon, the wheels are turning in the back of my head. There's a guy out there, a very prominent guy, who's really good at kind of arbitrarily floating these stories out there. They catch wind, and they usually end up, it being very good for a specific team, that plays in red and black. So I wonder if he has anything to do with this. And I'm talking about Coach Kirby Smart here, of kind of playing this narrative into his hands. I mean, if just thinking from his perspective, this is kind of right where I want the team, right where I want Gunner. I want Gunner in this hungry mindset, but I don't want to put too much on his shoulders. I don't want to put too much pressure or stress and just feeling like the weight of the world is on his shoulders. Man, I want this guy to go out there, play free, play relentless, and not feel like he has to do every single thing for the team and for the team to have success. So I don't know, man. If I'm just kind of putting my head coaching hat on, this is exactly what I want.
So I think all of that from Jake yesterday is so true in so many ways, that what Georgia wants to be is a full, complete team around Gunner Stockton. They're not looking to build what they're doing this season on the back of Gunner Stockton. They simply want him to be an important part of this. They want him to be one of the key components, but not the engine in and of itself. And that's one of the reasons why I think that Kirby Smart sort of shrugs off a lot of the media talk of, are we sure Gunner Stockton's the right guy for Georgia? Are we sure he's ready for all of this? I think that Kirby Smart sort of shrugs all that off. In fact, as Jake Fromm even alludes to there, he maybe even kind of invites some of this, because that's kind of sort of what Kirby has sort of done for fun in the past. And he may even kind of revels in the fact that that's going on. In fact, we know that a certain part of this is true, because if you want to go back to the last time the SEC got together, the spring meetings in Destin, Florida, remember, he poked some fun at Paul Feinbaum for this very reason, essentially making the statement of Jake Fromm seem even more true. You'll remember this from a few weeks ago. Let's hear Kirby Smart kind of doing exactly what Jake Fromm suggested yesterday he would do.
I just always hope that when I say these things at a busy time like this, that you are not. But I'm looking at a man whose job it is to tell you what's being said, right?
Yeah, I'm excited. Gunner got the message, man. He got the message. You did your job.
Okay. Listen, I have admired you and respected you for so many years.
Absolutely.
I feel like
way.
at this point in your career, you need a little help from me.
I appreciate
to get
that.
you to the first game and over the finish line.
I'm glad you did. You've always been. That's why I always come on your show, because I love the fact that you give me that motivation.
But it's important for but it's important to note here, even though we kind of have fun with that, and we have laughed at that clip a couple times now, it's important to note that for me, this is not about bulletin board material of Gunner's better than people think he is, and he's going to go out there and prove people wrong, although I certainly hope that he does. That's not what this is about for me. What this is about is that in the midst of an offseason in which there are a lot of people, both locally and nationally within the media, who seem to not really be quite so sure what Gunner Stockton is, have expressed some doubt about Gunner Stockton, have expressed some skepticism about Gunner Stockton, who've asked some pointed questions about Gunner Stockton, I think it's important to note, and the selection of Gunner for SEC Media Days next week indicates, that Kirby Smart doesn't share those concerns, that Kirby Smart's personal confidence in Gunner is far more confident, far more, I guess, secure than what others seem to think here right now. And if you're a Georgia fan, you want to take a lot of security from that Kirby seems to know something about Gunner that others don't, and of course he would. So if Kirby is so confident, if he does have this belief that, yes, Gunner is ready to be the guy for Georgia, well, where does that confidence come from? Well, I thought that Jake Fromm was also interesting yesterday in talking a little bit more about what he believes Gunner brings to the table.
Gunner is a phenomenal athlete, a phenomenal quarterback. I mean, this guy balled out in high school football, set plenty of records for the state of Georgia, and the state of Georgia is just littered with great quarterbacks who have gone on to do well in college and in the NFL. So, I mean, Gunner, he's that guy, and I don't expect anything less this fall, but I think it's just kind of playing with the narrative, playing with the mindset. I think, who knows, this may be Kirby's doing.
Interesting stuff from Jake Fromm yesterday. It's worth going back to yesterday's show, watching the full interview, because we had a lot to say about the quarterback position, even having some fun with, some sort of baked idea I had about how they can use Gunner Stockton effectively this year. A lot of that yesterday. You can go see that if you missed it. Now, let me sum all this up this way. Don't get it twisted that there are going to be some tough questions facing Georgia when it goes to SEC Media Days next week. The offense a year ago was a tremendous regression from where it had been in 2023, and it clearly needs to be better in 2025. And there'll be lots of sort of finger pointing about what the blame for last year lies on, and kind of whether Georgia is set up to have the improvement that it needs. Those questions are legitimate, and they will be asked of Kirby Smart and now of Gunner Stockton too. Tough questions that will be asked that Georgia will face. I think the point here is that by selecting Gunner Stockton to go with Georgia to SEC Media Days, when all the questions pop up about the Georgia offense, there'll be a suggestion from Smart by Gunner's presence that Georgia feels like it has the answers to those tough questions ready to put on display in 2025. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Brayden Pest Management. Boy, it is a thrill to have you with us. You've kind of been with us all summer long. We've had a great time, and now we really sort of feel like we are at the doorstep of the 2025 season, which is so exciting. And, of course, we're thankful to have you with us as we go through this ride next week for SEC Media Days. The season will be here shortly after that. Fall camp just right around the corner. Of course, as you know, plenty more good recruiting news here coming up for the Georgia Bulldogs. So we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. But first, quick thanks to our friends at Brayden Pest Management who make it all possible. I am a Georgia fan. You are a Georgia fan. We love the Georgia football conversation we're able to have every day. And one of the things that fills me with the greatest source of pride is the fact that so many of our great sponsors who are with us here, they themselves are also big Georgia fans too, and they love serving the Georgia fans in our audience. In the case of Brayden Pest Management, of course that's true. Our buddy Matt Brayden, big dog fan. We see him at Georgia games all the time. He's in Athens. He's traveling to see him play on the road. Just a guy that's been a great supporter of UGA for a long time, and a guy providing a great level of service to you, the Georgia fan. So if you're working with some sort of, kind of fly-by-night termite company and your cost of service is going up, you owe it to yourself to make the switch to Brayden Pest Management. Friendly folks, this is like a multi-generational company, incredible track record of success in business since 1975. And when you make the switch to Brayden Pest Management, they're going to put more money in your pocket just for making that decision. They're going to give you a better quality of service for a lower cost of service. That's a really good thing. So find them online today. It's BraydenPest.com. BREDA, BraydenPest.com. One more time on that website. It's BREDA, BraydenPest.com. Great to have Brayden Pest Management as a part of DawgNation Daily here today. All right, so earlier we talked about the fact that the CBS hot seat rankings have come out. Kirby Smart nowhere to be found on that, thankfully so, nor do we think he'll ever be. But boy, some of the coaches that Kirby Smart has been beaten up on in recent years, they are certainly on that list. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit, why this could be, I think, a pretty tumultuous year in the SEC. And some of this will be reflected by SEC Media Days next week. We've also got Mike Griffith here coming up in just a moment, too. Prior to that, though, let's get ready to go around the doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And in the spirit of Georgia Farm Bureau, let's talk about some homegrown Georgia talent here for a moment, because we had an incredible run of recruiting that stretched there was a 7-day period. Georgia got a commitment every single day. You had this incredible streak of basically for like a 2-week period, Georgia almost got at least one recruit on average every one of those days. It certainly felt that way. It's been a little quiet since then, as you'd imagine it would be, but that quiet sort of calm after a flurry of commitments, we would say that's not expected to maybe last very long. In fact, go ahead and sort of mark your calendars for Saturday if you haven't done that already. We are awaiting the possibility of 2 more, at least potentially, names added to the 2026 class for Georgia. Tyree Green, the defensive back from Buford, you know about him. He is going to announce on Saturday. We're watching that very closely. And also another guy that we've been watching pretty closely here too, the 5-star tight end Caden Prothro. He is getting ready to announce on Saturday. And I think the rumor out there is that DawgNation could have live coverage for Prothro coming on Saturday. We'll give you more information about that when we, I guess, can confirm all those details. But there's a very good chance that we're able to be with you kind of watching it unfold for Prothro on Saturday. Really excited about that. And really excited about Green too. So we think in their own way, both these battles are pretty interesting. I'll focus on the Prothro part of this perhaps just a little bit more for a moment, just simply because, this is a guy that Georgia's been heavily invested in, but it's also gotten tight end commits. It just got Brayden Fogel going back just a few days ago, was heavily involved in Mark Bowman for a while. But Prothro has always been one of the most coveted players in this class for Georgia, no matter who you've seen Georgia take commitments from or who Georgia's also seemingly been pursuing. Prothro has been a major priority for UGA. There's also been chatter of, like, for instance, what a Texas might try to do to kind of get in the mix for Prothro. There's obviously major, as you would assume, for a player of this magnitude, major NIL dollars being thrown around. But thus far, doesn't seem like that's nudged Georgia off of its position very much. It seems like it's still in a pretty good spot for him overall. We're obviously always on guard for last-minute changes and things like that. We're always kind of watching out for that. But it certainly seems like that Georgia goes into the weekend with a little bit of confidence about what might happen for Prothro, what might also happen for Green as Georgia continues to really sort of stock up in the defensive secondary. Coach T-Rob and obviously Dante Williams, the cornerbacks coach, they've really been doing work as of late, adding into this Georgia defensive back room. And Green, if he were to land at Georgia on Saturday, would be another example of that. And there are still big gets to come in this class for Georgia, or at least Georgia pursuing those big gets. Tyler Atkinson remains out there. Derek Cooper in some form or fashion remains out there. So even with the flurry of recent commitments to Georgia, there are still big names for the Dogs to potentially get in this 2026 class, and two of those could potentially land in this class on Saturday. I'll also remind you of this. Our Jeff Sentell is on vacation right now, but the DawgNation recruiting show Before the Hedges presented by Kroger will still be here tonight. Kaylee Manziel, who's always a part of the program, Cody Chaffins, who's going to join tonight. They'll have plenty more on what to expect from Prothro on Saturday, what to expect potentially from Green, and when we might hear a little bit more about guys like Derek Cooper and Tyler Atkinson and what could be coming next for this 2026 class. They'll have that for you this evening Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, so stay tuned to the DawgNation video channels for more on that. Now, one more recruiting note to give you here for a moment, and I would say that one of my worst characteristics, among many probably, but one of my worst is as much as I try to be just sort of rock solid in my consistency and never wavering in my closely held beliefs, unfortunately, I am someone who at times thinks one thing, aspires to one thing, but my actual behavior is less than my own standard that I would like to seek for myself. I am just imperfect in that way. There is a word for this. Sometimes I am a bit of a hypocrite. So I'm going to be slightly hypocritical here for a moment because my standard of belief is I think it's important to be careful about showing too much hubris. I think that pride comes before the fall, and anything that's a little too out there as it relates to stuff like that, especially for young players and recruits, I think it can be dangerous. I think it's the sort of thing you got to be careful about. However, there are occasionally moments when a recruit does the opposite of that, and I am wildly entertained by it. I'm not proud of myself for that, but I just sort of am that way. So let me give you an example of this coming from Chase Calicut. Speaking of Georgia doing some major work in the defensive secondary, Calicut, and there are a lot of people who've watched his film, North Shore High School, Houston, Texas, major program in that talent-rich state. They'll tell you that you talk about a ball hawk and just a guy that gets the football and plays aggressively in the defensive secondary. There are a lot of people who watched Calicut closely. They think there is a lot to like about him. Well, in addition to whatever on-field prowess he brings, there is something else that I like about Calicut, whether I should or not. I love the fact he's got a little spice to him, got a little edge to him, and I love the fact that he's directing some of that at the in-state power where he lives. I'm talking about the University of Texas here for a moment. Could not help but notice this X post from him the other day, social media post on the X platform. I don't advise recruits to be this sort of out there. I don't know that it's classy or even recommended to, talk trash like this. But I do think it's funny, as much as I, have to admit, I do think it's funny. So this is what Chase Calicut put on X the other day. He said, "The best in Texas leave Texas." Remember that. Hashtag Go Dogs. And I like it. I probably shouldn't. I don't recommend it. But still, you can't help it sometimes. I think that's pretty funny. And I do think it's the sort of thing that we're likely to see a little more of because, Texas is a little bit like Georgia. Georgia has a major, major level of talent in its own state, and yet Georgia's also a pretty big national recruiting program. It even seems like they've sort of reinforced their in-state recruiting last couple of years, and yet still there's going to be sort of a major national presence in this year's recruiting class. They are just a major program in a talent-rich state, but they still recruit nationally. Texas is sort of a version of that too, where, Texas could conceivably only recruit Texans and have a pretty good class, but Texas wants to go nationally for its recruiting wins. And some of that, by the way, is into the state of Georgia. They're at least trying. Last year, they succeeded when it comes to Justice Terry. So Georgia and Texas, despite the fact they're about 1,000 miles from each other, Georgia and Texas are going to butt heads in recruiting a lot in future years. They are also going to butt heads on the field a bunch, too. They played twice a year ago. They will play at least once this year, but it would not be any kind of stretch to the imagination to say they could play at least a second, if not possibly even a third time here this season. And as I've told you, you take two teams that a couple of years ago were essentially strangers, had almost no history with each other. You start putting them on the field against each other repeatedly over the course of a small period of years. Pretty soon you go from strangers to now you're in an actually legitimate rivalry. And so a guy like Chase Calicut talking trash to the Longhorns on behalf of Georgia, this is the sort of thing we may see a little bit more of. And I got to tell you, whether I should be or not, I'm pretty entertained by it. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. Now, Chase Calicut, not a homegrown Georgian, but it sounds like he fits in pretty well with those who are, and Georgia fans are going to no doubt love him when he gets here to Georgia. And if Chase is like a lot of folks, you get to Georgia, you look around, you're like, I'm never leaving this place the rest of my life, because that's just what Georgia does for so many of us. We love our state, and we love working with companies that also love our state and are dedicated to serving people in our state. And that's what Georgia Farm Bureau is. For a long time, it's been the agricultural community they've supported. We're proud of the efforts they put forth, especially when disaster strikes and things like that. You've got these weather-related catastrophes and, crops get destroyed. Oftentimes, Georgia Farm Bureau is at the forefront of kind of helping our farmers in situations like that, which we are 100% behind. But we also love the fact that when it comes to sort of the basic insurance needs that farmers have had, they provided that. Well, they can also provide that same level of service for you. Auto insurance, home insurance, life insurance, and other things that sort of exist in that kind of financial services realm. Georgia Farm Bureau can provide all of that. They're always the home team, friendly folks here in Georgia just like you, and they're standing by right now. So give them a call, 877-404-1050. That's 877-404-1050, or online, GFB Insurance. Of course, stands for Georgia Farm Bureau, GFBinsurance.com. Make sure you check out Georgia Farm Bureau today and find out why they are always the home team. All right, we're going to pick up the pace here a little bit. We're going to bring on our buddy Mike Griffith. Big preview of everything coming at SEC Media Days next week, including the Three Dogs, who'll be joining Kirby Smart, speaking to everybody in Atlanta next week. Let's do that right now, here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Brayden Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let us say hello to Mike Griffith here, DawgNation Daily, presented by Brayden Pest Management. It feels like we haven't talked to Mike in a little while. He was away, I was away, now we're all back here together and getting ready for SEC Media Days next week. And Mike, I've said it, I think the selection of the three Georgia players for next week, the spokesman for the team, pretty revealing. Not difficult to predict necessarily in the case of Everett and Allen. I would say the Gunner Stockton was not what I expected to be true. There are a lot of quarterbacks going to SEC media days. I didn't necessarily think Stockton would be one because Kirby Smart doesn't always take a quarterback to media days, but he is taking Gunner. Now, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily indicate what kind of year Gunner Stockton's going to have. For instance, JT Daniels went in 2021. Obviously, that didn't quite work out the way that Georgia thought it was going to. But it does, I think, reveal the level of confidence that Kirby Smart has in Gunner Stockton. And that's the sort of thing, Mike, if you're a Georgia fan, I think you take a lot of security from Kirby's confidence because he's behind closed doors. He sees things that fans and media don't see, that he knows things they don't know, and he seems to really like his quarterback. And if you're a Georgia fan, I think that's really good news. What do you make of Gunner going to media days?
Yeah, I kind of look at those guys as leaders. You mentioned JT. He was clearly the leader of the 2021 team going into the season in the quarterback room. And I think Gunner has established himself as that at Georgia. And I think it's a big vote of confidence. I mean, to me, that says there is no quarterback competition as far as who's going to start the opener. It says that it is Gunner's job. Kirby hasn't said that, but this action indicates that he's confident in Gunner Stockton, and he's going to give Gunner the opportunity to go there and build his brand. I mean, we got to look at this now as a brand building opportunity for these kids. And, I know nobody wants to talk about how much they make, but that is a big part of it. And it is an attractive element of it. And it shows that, hey, if you're the quarterback at Georgia, you're going to get these opportunities to be on stage and market your brand and kind of tell your story. And, Gunner's never been, a guy to run in front of the cameras. I don't think he even talked after the spring game. He's very modest and very humble in his comments. I don't expect any big headlines from Gunner Stockton there, but I think it says this is the leader of the Georgia offense. And like you, I was a little surprised. I thought maybe we'd see an offensive lineman, right? Like an Ernest Green or who knows, maybe Dylan Bell, a guy that's, recommitted to, catching the ball effectively, or Oscar Delp, someone like that. But instead, Kirby goes with Gunner. And I think this is a guy a lot of people are going to want to talk to from other places in the media that don't know much about him. He didn't really get marketed playing time until the second half of the Texas game, and then he started the Notre Dame game. That's pretty much it. I think he had some cleanup duty against Florida State as well, but for the most part, a lot of people don't know much about Gunner Stockton, and this is going to give him an opportunity to represent himself in the brand in Atlanta.
And I do think that all that said, I do think there are some tough questions facing Georgia next week, and a lot of those Stockton will be kind of called upon to answer. He does have a close relationship with Mike Bobo, for instance. We know, fair or not, a lot of questions will be asked about, what Georgia was or wasn't offensively a year ago, the role that the offensive coordinator played in that. I mean, statistically speaking, there was just regression, and how it gets better here this year. So, Gunner will be in an interesting spot next week as kind of the lone offensive representative among players for Georgia there. Of these tough questions that are just going to come Georgia's way, Gunner is, Mike, going to be called upon to answer some of those.
Yeah, he'll be called upon to answer them, but I don't think he will. Like I said, you've interviewed him just like I have, and he's rather bland. He's not going to say anything too controversial. I think that's the way Kirby Smart likes it. Gunner's good at, not saying much. And honestly, I think Kirby doesn't want there to be a lot of headlines, and put this in perspective, Brandon. To me, it's kind of refreshing that we're going there talking about football. I mean, you think about some of the storylines and, knock on wood, but, we're not talking about fast cars and speeding tickets and guys suspended. We're talking about football, and that says something too, that we haven't been talking about off-field issues with Georgia, that this program does have the sort of discipline that Kirby Smart has been working towards, because that was an issue in past years, and now you don't have those distractions. So now we're talking about football issues, right? A reloaded offensive line with 4 new starters. As far as the struggles last year, there's no way to get around it. It was an abomination for Georgia to lead the nation in drop passes. If you're not dropping passes, Carson Beck looks a lot better. You probably beat Alabama without a drop pass and a missed assignment in the first quarter. If your receivers just do their job and catch the football, things look a lot different. Third downs, third down conversion rate, Carson Beck's numbers, the 1-loss record. the ability to move the ball, the amount that was put on the defense because of some of the turnovers and drop passes. To me, it's as simple as catching the football, and that fixes last year's Georgia team. That's what I believe. We'll see what happens this year with Gunner. How you compare Gunner to Carson. Carson was rated the number one player in the transfer portal. Is Georgia taking a step back at the quarterback position? Well, it doesn't matter. This is what they've got. Gunner was obviously behind Carson on the depth chart, but you've noted he brings some different qualities to the team. I believe some leadership. I think the cohesion will be better, even though there's a lot of transfer receivers. You get the feeling that Gunner stuck around and done a lot to build the chemistry. Now it's just a matter, does he have the talent and will he have the protection on the offensive line? And can they get a running game going? A lot of injuries last year. Can they get a running game going to balance this thing out?
And that's, to me, the really big thing. And you're right. I mean, like, it's not good to lead the nation in drops. That's obviously not what you want to do. And the sheer yardage that kind of sort of accumulated that you lost because of those drops, obviously that's a problem. But I think that was more magnified by the fact that just Georgia just fell off the earth when it came to running the football a year ago. They're basically outside the top 100 when it comes to rushing yards per game. And to me, I mean, they're both significant issues, but the lack of running game, to me, way more significant than the drops. If anything, it made the drops seem worse because that's sort of at times all you felt like you had. And some of this was related to injury. Georgia just didn't have that between the tackles running threat a year ago. A lot of that, I think, was because of injury. I think this year, I think they have a chance to be way better in that regard. And that is the pathway, I think, for Georgia to be better offensively. If you're setting third down up to be a little shorter because you're running more, on the early downs and you're just getting some easier yards, all of a sudden you have more sustained drives. You have more trips into the red zone, which are going to result in more points overall. I mean, if you want the simple path for offensive improvement for Georgia, that to me is it. And I do think it can happen. But you just got to add a better running game component than what you had a year ago. I think a lot of the obvious and measurable offensive struggles for Georgia, I think it actually traces back to that maybe more so than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all goes together, because a lot of those drop passes were the quote unquote extended run game. We saw that a lot in 2022 with Stetson Bennett. Short passes on first down that if the guy catches it, it's a 4 or 5 yard gain. And now it's 2nd and 6 instead of 2nd and 10. So, yes, I think that the injuries in the backfield led to Mike Bobo having to be a little bit more creative in terms of how he created the efficiency of a run game. You heard Todd Monken talk a lot about, the extended run game, which were those quick passes in the flats. It acted like a run. You've heard Kirby Smart talk about that as well, that even though it's technically a pass, they consider it a run because it's a high percentage pass in the flats or it's a quick pass to a receiver. So many of those were dropped. And so now instead of 2nd and 5 and 2nd and 6, you're dealing with 2nd and 10. Or maybe on 2nd and 10, the 7-yard pass is dropped. And instead of it being a 3rd and 3 rundown or potential rundown, now it's 3rd and 10. So I think it all goes together because of the injuries to the running back. You had to get creative in how you threw the ball. The big question marks that, that myself and Cody Chaffins talked about on Monday nights on the Beat Show, Brandon, was where were the tight ends? Right, we saw quick passes to receivers and Cash Jones at times, and out of the backfield, ETN when he was healthy. But where was the surge of receivers? We've heard so much about Todd Hartley and what a great recruiter and what a great coach he is. But if you look at the tight end production last year, it was really poor. And I was a little surprised to see when Phil Steele, not that Phil Steele's the end all be all, there's several preseason magazines and prognosticators, but I think he does a pretty good job. There wasn't a Georgia guy first, second, third, or fourth team at tight end. And I just throw my hands up and go, wait a minute. You got Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky. These are both potential NFL draftees next season in the first 3 or 4 rounds, but they're not first, second, third, or fourth team. We've heard a lot about Jaden Riddell. How involved will he get? We saw him make a catch and a great run. Obviously, Elias Williams comes in. He looks like a freak at tight end. So I'm optimistic that maybe you get the tight ends a little bit more involved. Obviously, there's an influx of transfer receivers that are very talented. You're seeing Branch get a little preseason play. I guess he's kind of the marquee guy. the hot name. You wonder how Dylan Bell recovers. We've seen him be a playmaker and see him used as a weapon in many different ways. And we mentioned Cash Jones, Frazier. Can Frazier take the next step and maybe be a little more versatile out of the backfield, hold on to the ball when he runs it, catch it when it's thrown to him? So there's some player development that needs to take place for Gunner to have these weapons, and then he's got to make good decisions. And Kirby kind of called him out in the spring game, him and Ryan Puglisi, for some decision making. He said they had some good moments and some poor moments. So all that has to come together. It's a lot. And really, Brandon, I don't know, when was the last time we saw Georgia offense go into a season with all these questions, would you say?
Well, I mean, it certainly happened before. I mean, probably pre-national championship era, I guess. But, I mean, it certainly happened before. And there's always going to be some sort of prevailing questions somewhere. I don't think that makes Georgia all that different. But it's probably certainly been kind of like prior to a national championship, era in 2021, 2022, that Georgia probably has faced this to the pronounced level it will here this year. And so, Mike, what that leads me to is something I talked about, I think it was last week, which is, how much Kirby Smart will sort of address that head on, because to be honest, I thought in the post game of the Sugar Bowl, he didn't really do that. When asked, hey, what was wrong with your offense this year? Sort of kind of rattled off, we played a tough schedule and blah, blah, blah. He didn't really sort of take that head on. But oftentimes in SEC media days, with whatever the prevailing issue might be, Smart's more than happy to kind of confront that at face value, head on, openly and honestly. I will say that's one of the things I'm kind of tuned in for next week, how much Georgia, and Kirby Smart in particular, does address the fact that, boy, the thing that probably kept Georgia from winning, or at least being in kind of like the thick of the national championship conversation at the end of the season, is they were just significantly worse offensively, not from what they had been in 2021, 2022, but from what they had been in 2023 when they still averaged like 40 points per game. Like even in like Mike Bobo's return as offensive coordinator, this was one of the best offenses in America in 2023. And by the way, people say, well, Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers, those guys never played with each other that year, and they both missed significant time during the year. So you can't put all of that offensive success on McConkey and Bowers, because the Ole Miss game is essentially the only time they really played together all year long. They were banged up for much of that year, but the numbers overall for Georgia were stellar. Last year, big drop. I think it would behoove Georgia to openly acknowledge the need for improvement there. I do think it'll be interesting to see how much of that they actually do.
Yeah, and we have to ask, how much of this is on Kirby Smart? I mean, we talk a lot about Mike Bobo this and Mike Bobo that, but the head coaches in those meetings and, some of those slow starts, how much of that is conservative play calling? How much of that is Kirby wanting to be careful with the football early and not wanting to turn it over and give his defense a chance? Because I think in many ways, Georgia plays to his defense often. So we can't put it all on Mike Bobo. I think that the head coach has a lot to do with the offensive scheme. I remember Todd Monken telling us, that there was a certain parameters that Kirby wanted him to work within. Kirby obviously wants balance. Every coach does, but I think Kirby really wanted to establish that run game. I think we're going to hear a lot about that. We heard Kirby tell us in the spring how much they were going to work on the run game. And with a retooled offensive line, I mean, these are all talented, developed players. I don't think replacing 4 starters on the offensive line at Georgia is quite as daunting as other places because they've recruited so well. I think Stacey Searles is a very good coach, and we've seen offensive line development. We just kind of take it for granted, right? I don't think you really see a bad offensive line. Now, last year there was a lack of cohesion with injuries. We mentioned the drop passes that put that offense in a lot more predictable situations. Didn't really turn Carson Beck loose to run the ball until the Tennessee game. They told him not to. So there was a lot of issues that I thought Georgia kind of brought on themselves between the injuries on the offensive line and running back, the drop passes, the conservativeness with allowing Carson Beck to use his mobility. I think Kirby's got to kind of turn these guys loose a little bit. And I think Gunner Stockton is a guy you can do that with because he's a very aggressive, physical guy by nature. And then the question becomes, does Gunner learn to slide? Because he can't take those kind of hits like he took last year and expect to get through the year. So I expect Kirby to talk about establishing the run game and Gunner using all of his weapons. And yes, you've got to think these tight ends are going to be more involved. If this is a winning edge, which we've been led to believe it is, then they need to exercise it. Or was it just that Brock Bowers was that doggone good?
Well, Bowers is an all-time great for sure, but I think the tight ends are probably set up for Georgia pretty well here this year too. Let me finish with this. When you kind of broaden this, beyond Georgia for a moment, I think there are two big storylines for media days next week. The one is after a couple of quiet off seasons where there has not been a lot of turmoil in terms of coaches losing their job, Mike, I think there could be as many as 6 replaced at the end of this year. And that may end up being a high number, but it's not unreasonable either to think that there are at least 6 guys who in some form or fashion are sort of fighting to keep their job. I think coaches on the hot seat and dissatisfied fans, and frankly, in some cases, dissatisfied coaches, I think that's going to be a pretty big topic next week. That's issue 1. And issue 2 is, and it's probably the single biggest thing of the entire week, is the fact that Arch Manning, whether he ends up being the kind of player that warrants this or not, we'll find out, is a celebrity within the SEC, the likes of which we haven't seen since Johnny Manziel, Tim Tebow. This is a crossover level of fame that, like the Stephen A. Smith and the very low information sort of, I'll call them lamestream media, the sort of regular daytime TV folks, they're aware of. Arch Manning's a true celebrity, and I think next week he's going to sort of be treated that way. That, to me, is probably the single biggest story of the week.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he is football royalty. I mean, he's a Manning, and he's the namesake of his famous grandfather, who was an unbelievable player at Ole Miss and a great ambassador for the league all these years, obviously Peyton and Eli. And I think they've managed it well. I mean, you haven't really heard much about Arch Manning, and it's hard for anyone in Georgia to really, throw spitballs at the screen. I mean, this is a guy Georgia sold out for. They wanted him. Georgia wanted him really bad, and at one point they thought they had him. And Texas money, all gas, no brakes offense, supposedly, right? And the Texas money won out. I think that will be a big storyline. I don't know how much Arch is really going to say. What can he say? He didn't really do much. I mean, the story of the SEC championship was Gunner Stockton coming off the bench and winning a game, not Arch Manning. He sat behind 7th-round pick Quinn Ewers as Texas lost the game, and maybe Sark figured he threw him out there, when Georgia played him in October, and he about got killed. Got the ball knocked loose, and had a couple nice plays, couple first downs, but wasn't ready for the moment. It'll be interesting to see how ready Arch is on the field. As far as in front of the camera, I think he'll do fine. I mean, he's a very polished athlete. This is a very famous family that's very good in front of the media. I think a lot of things will probably, I don't want to say be rehearsed, but I think they're going to know what they're going to say before they get there. That's a big story. College football playoff. We're going to hear the SEC make a play for the 5-11. And, Brandon, I heard there's another big celebrity that's going to be there all 4 days doing DawgNation Daily. That's something a little bit different than I think the SEC media is going to notice. We're going to have a pretty big presence there with you being there all 4 days. And of course, Kaylee Manziel is going to be there and Cody Chafin. So I'll be there, Connor Riley. I mean, I really look forward to DawgNation really being able to canvas this event in our backyard. So all these stories, like you're talking about the Arch Mannings, and I mentioned the college football playoff model, what they say about Georgia. How much is Georgia talked about? I mean, Alabama, all of a sudden, a lot of sex appeal for the Tide with offensive line returning. They've got a 5-star quarterback. They got a really good backup, too. Kalen DeBoer gets his offensive coordinator. LSU, #1 in the portal. Lane Kiffin, he always manages to say something a little interesting. He had some personal disclosure this offseason. You wonder how much people are going to follow up that. And then the hot seat stuff. Right? So Hugh Freeze at Auburn, certainly a hot one. Sam Pittman at Arkansas. Everybody loves Sam. I think everybody wants to see him keep his job, right? So there is a lot to talk. Mark Stoops in Kentucky. Can the divorce be any worse? I mean, they can't afford to buy him out. He wants to leave. I mean, that's an ugly situation. Yeah. So there is a ton of storylines that are going to be coming out of media days next week. And it will be interesting to see what these newsmakers say in front of the cameras and on DawgNation Daily as well, as you're going to be covering that every day. I look forward to seeing that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too, Mike. Good stuff. We'll see you there in Atlanta. I know you'll have plenty of coverage. We'll read that for me at DawgNation.com. And, of course, we'll talk to you very soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Brayden Pest Management as well. Appreciate it, Brandon. Have a good one. You too.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so, Mike kind of talked about this a moment ago when it comes to, like, the so-called brand building. And There was a version that I was sort of also thinking about too. Gunner Stockton is going to SEC Media Days. I don't know this is why he's going. I assume it's not. But there are like 11, I think, quarterbacks in all going, which is more quarterbacks, at least I think, and I think others think this too, more quarterbacks than we're used to seeing. And part of me kind of wondered, in this NIL age where there is still going to be third-party NIL, in addition to the revenue sharing, how much of this is about sort of justifying your quarterback? I used the word celebrity a moment ago. College football players are pretty famous within the kind of fandom of college football, but celebrities sort of transcend that. So not everybody's in the same category that Arch Manning is, no matter how good Arch turns out to be. But if you want to justify good NIL dollars for your quarterback, therefore you have more money within your revenue sharing to pay other players, making them available at events like this is sort of your way of kind of justifying their market value so that Deloitte, who's the third party that's kind of scrutinizing these NIL deals, that perhaps they'll just kind of give a little less oversight and a little bit less, kind of investigation of the quarterback NIL deal. They'll just eventually get to a point where maybe they're rubber stamping those to kind of save money to kind of put towards the other players. You do kind of wonder if programs might try to make their quarterbacks a little bit more well-known, a little bit, kind of cultivate their brand or celebrity status a little bit more, justify big NIL dollars for them. Therefore, they can kind of then use more of the revenue sharing in the other players and just have a little bit better way to manage your salary cap, or it's really more of a salary budget than a cap. I did kind of wonder that just a bit. Let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here today. And we're going to do this for our Golden Shoe a little bit later on. One of our great DawgNation cruisers reaching out. And I tell you, man, it's one of the things that I'm so proud of, that each year we're able to have such an incredible experience on the DawgNation cruise. And they're all going to Perfect Day Coco Cay on the wonderful ship that is Utopia of the Seas. And I don't know, man, it's just one of those things that just fills me with such a great sense of pride to know the community that we formed around that, the sort of special bond and camaraderie you have with the people that you sail with over the course of that time. So we are here in July, and next April may seem like kind of a long time from now. But if you want to be with us on Perfect Day Coco Cay, if you want to have the great experience on Utopia of the Seas, this is a wonderful time to start planning for next April and that DawgNation cruise. And Jessica Slater is a wonderful travel advisor. She's going to tell you all about it. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. Of course, there's all kinds of great options for you when it comes to Royal Caribbean, the debut of Star of the Seas and everything else. But boy, what a great time to be with us next April on board Utopia of the Seas for our DawgNation cruise. I hope you will be there. So, cruise around the SEC here for a moment. Let me give you a recruiting note to kick things off. Saw where 4-star linebacker from Kell, that's Brayden Rouse, who had been a major target for multiple SEC teams. Rouse is committed to Tennessee. So, let's start with, Josh Heupel's kind of figuring some things out. And obviously, NIL is a big reason for this. And we'll probably, at some point in time this week, kind of get into what Ross Dellinger has written this week about the complicated nature of NIL deals in the revenue sharing age and how many of these are likely to be accepted and what teams are doing in terms of making promises they can't keep. There is a lot to get to when it comes to that. We'll do some of that this week. But putting that aside for a moment, Tennessee has had an aggressive approach to NIL. We assume they're still taking it. But the end result is, Josh Heupel, prior to coming to Tennessee, when he was the head coach at UCF, he was not thought of as a great recruiter. UCF, even by its own sort of group of five at the time standards, was probably recruiting a little bit below what their weight class suggests they probably should have been. Well, pretty clearly, Heupel's doing much better than that now. And we're not Tennessee fans. We're the exact opposite. We're not even really that big a fan of Heupel necessarily. But when you look at coaches who are producing a certain level of staying power at their current job, pretty clearly Heupel is that guy. He just is. And for a Tennessee team, we use the word stability a lot to kick off the show as it relates to Georgia. Well, Tennessee obviously had none of that for more than a decade. Heupel is clearly bringing some of that right now. He deserves credit for it. Just objectively speaking. It's also interesting who Tennessee beat out for Rouse. This was a major target for Texas. And another example of what there seems to be a lot of, and this is way too soon to say this is a prevailing trend or anything like that, because losing out on Rouse may just force Texas to double down even more on Tyler Atkinson. That's at least a possibility. You have to consider it. But it seems to me, as an observer several hundred miles away, it seems to me that Texas has made big, sizable monetary offers, at least allegedly, to numerous recruits in this class. And oftentimes they have, at least by perception, lost out on that recruiting battle, despite being perhaps the biggest offer to that particular player. Now, it's way too soon to say this is a trend because they swooped in the last minute, got Justice Terry last year. Georgia fans certainly still remember that. Maybe that happens with Prothrow on Saturday. I don't think it will, but maybe it does. Maybe it just makes them more of a potent player for Atkinson. Perhaps that's the case. But I think this Rouse story, Rouse going to Tennessee, is just as big for him not going to Texas as it is for him going to Tennessee. To say it a different way, this is as significant for where he isn't going as it is for where he is going. Tennessee coming in state, very good program, Kell, getting a terrific linebacker in Brayden Rouse. Big story from yesterday. So we also started the show by talking about the CBS Sports hot seat rankings. They've done this every year. It's typically been Dennis Dodd. As a pretty big consumer of college football media content, I will say that when Dodd did this for many, many years, this is in the weeds and you don't care, but I'm going to just, this is my own sort of personal feedback. When Dodd did this for many years, it was very simple and very straightforward. He just did his rankings, and it was easy to read, and you just sort of did it. Well, now they've got like a panel of people, and they're all voting, and it kind of shows up like an Excel spreadsheet. It is nowhere near as much fun of a user experience as it used to be when it comes to hot seat rankings, and I do like kind of consuming this content. Nowhere near as useful. So if any of our friends from CBS Sports are listening right now, let me just tell you that I would say that the user experience for your hot seat rankings this year, probably not quite as easily consumed as it has been in the past. But nonetheless, there were several SEC coaches, as you know, on kind of the hottest seat of them all for the upcoming season. Now, what I think about this is that it just goes to show you how conversations can sort of change pretty quickly. For instance, according to CBS Sports and their panel of voters, the hottest seat in the SEC for this upcoming season belongs to Brent Venables in Oklahoma. But what's weird about that is that the other day we crowned Oklahoma as the offseason national champs. Controversial pick. There are others that were in contention. But Oklahoma has suddenly been kind of thrust in at least a top 20 conversation, if not like a playoff contender. And some people have them in the top 10 because they bring in, Mateer, the quarterback, and the running back from Cal, Jay Knott. Suddenly they're a major player for all kinds of, success here this season, despite the fact that Venables at one point in time was likely to be fired. And so this is why we can't buy into too much of the recent hype about Oklahoma on the back of these transfers, is because this is still a coach with a very tenuous grip on his job. And we talked about Joe Castiglione retiring yesterday. There's all kinds of change happening around Oklahoma. And a lot of this seems to be with sort of a long-range, trajectory in mind, a long-range planning in mind, which leads to believe that at Oklahoma, we think they're thinking about life after Venables. And if they're thinking about that, which I believe they are, I would say the chance for success this season probably pretty limited. In other words, CBS, by ranking Venables as high as it does on their hot seat list, kind of brings us back to where we started the year, calendar speaking wise. And I think that's probably the right place to be. Sam Pittman's on here. Look, Pittman would retire tomorrow and be the happiest guy in the world. I'd love to see him coach in the SEC for another 10 years. I think they rightly point out that one of the things that he did a year ago was, kind of bring in the good quarterback, Taylor Green from Boise State. It seems like they just sort of stole him out of nowhere. Without much fanfare, they brought in a quarterback that's really pretty good. And that's one of the reasons why Pittman's probably still employed. But if Pittman gets told, hey, thanks for your time served, now you can go live at the lake and enjoy your life, he'll be the first one to do that and be happy to do so. But we'll see if anything changed for him here this year. Hugh Freeze is also on here, among the higher-rated coaches in the SEC in terms of his hot seat status. This is also one that's just changed really quick. Because, I think I still do somewhat have Auburn is my perhaps sort of surprise turnaround team in the SEC. They are my SEC dark horse. But boy, their recruiting momentum is just non-existent. And oftentimes that can be a tell. Now, they did get like a 3-star, I think it's a linebacker yesterday. When you're celebrating the 3-star committed a place like Auburn, that gives you an idea of how bad it's been. And Hugh Freeze is just a little bit of a weird guy. And, his weirdness comes shining through in a very awkward way in moments like this. And it certainly seems like there is perhaps a strained relationship between Freeze and his key boosters. So he's either going to go out this season and just sort of go for broke and, coach with reckless abandon, trying to get the wins he needs to stay employed, or perhaps it's just over for him. But a lot of this has sort of happened pretty quickly. It's also interesting to see, and I'll make this the last one I mentioned, that Billy Napier, it seems like some of the hot seat stuff around him has at least quieted somewhat a bit, at least a little bit. It's not quite as significant as it once was. I think this is also sort of revisionist history in the wrong direction. We just don't have very long memories, collectively speaking. People forget, prior to a little bit of a modest turnaround near the end of last season, how mad Florida fans were at Billy Napier and how much they were demanding change offensively and bringing kind of a new voice offensively. Do y'all realize that none of that happened? Like what we were reportedly told was like the condition for Napier's return, his continued employment was contingent on bringing in some new offensive voices. They essentially did not do that, and Napier's still here. This is one of those that I would watch very closely. Scheduled is essentially as tough this year as it was a year ago. He was on a scorching hot seat during the season. A couple of wins near the end of the year has sort of caused collective amnesia on the part of everyone. I'd watch this one pretty closely. I think if you're looking for an implosion that sort of happens, because right now people have got Florida in like the preseason top 15, and they're like what I think Auburn could do. Collectively, a lot more people seem to think Florida will do. I think that's just destined to be wrong. Of course, I'm a Gator hater. You can judge me as biased on this if you want. It is my opinion, nonetheless, that we may see some stuff around Billy Napier get pretty hot pretty quick once this season gets going, because we were almost there last year. Let me also mention this. I meant to do this yesterday. We just sort of ran out of time, and probably we should be running out of time now. But I saw where our friends from The Athletic ranked their top rivalries in college football. Now, many of you know The Athletic is owned by the New York Times. What this kind of reminds me of a little bit is, and we don't do a lot of this kind of thing around here, but the New York Times of the day also put out their top movies of the 21st century. It's one of those things that's sort of designed to generate debate, but it's also kind of one of those things that sort of feels very New York Times-like, where it's like, you look at the movies, it's like Parasite is the best movie of the century so far. And you're looking at this list of movies and you're like, okay, this is sort of what I would think the New York Times would say, but no real person thinks any of this. Like none of the movies sort of near the top, the sort of real people, average people, no one actually thinks this. It's not a surprise they wrote this, but nobody actually thinks any of this. Well, the New York Times owned athletics ranking of the top rivalries. I sort of felt the same way about. Let me show this on the screen here for a moment. There are two that jump out to me. They've got USC, and we can put that back up again. They've got two that jump out to me. USC Notre Dame coming in at number 5. Now, historically, obviously, this is a huge rivalry, but this is also not the 1970s. I mean, we've even seen reporting in the last couple of weeks that this rivalry might not even be played in future years. And we also saw this a year ago. I mean, obviously Notre Dame beat Georgia, so that clearly is what it is. But we saw a year ago when it comes to like college football playoff ratings and things like that, the idea that Notre Dame is the pun intended gold standard brand in college football, TV ratings a year ago don't suggest that's true. They just don't. So the idea that USC Notre Dame is the 5th best rivalry in college football, I'm sure your grandfather thought that, but your best friend does not think that. He just doesn't, and I think you already know that. The other one of these that kind of jumped out to me is Minnesota-Wisconsin, the battle for Paul Bunyan's axe coming in at number 10. Now, listen, I love all these Big Ten rivalry games where they play for trophies and do stuff like that. I love that kind of thing. And I love Paul Bunyan's act. I think this stuff's really fun. I'm a big college football fan. I like all of this. But once again, there is nobody who, I mean, literally nobody, no real person thinks that Minnesota-Wisconsin is a better, more interesting, more enjoyable rivalry than Alabama-Tennessee, which it's ranked ahead of, Alabama-LSU, which it's ranked ahead of, Texas A&M, which it's ranked ahead of. There is nobody who thinks any of that. It's just not a real person's thought. It is a common perspective within the media, but it is not reflective of college football fans at all. Now, lists like this are designed to generate debate, and so I guess this has worked the way that it's supposed to. But I do think it reflects a pretty interesting divide between what is sort of common opinion within the media and how foreign that is to most college football fans. And we will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And before we get ready to wrap things up here today, let's give a shout out to our friends at Dr. Pepper. Because let me tell you what the common fan does think. The common fan thinks there is nothing that goes with college football more than the original, delicious, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper. For Dr. Pepper in college football, it's a pepper thing. Also, a lot of folks excited about the brand new addition to the Jurassic Park cinema universe. The brand new Jurassic World Rebirth. I have a hard time keeping up with all the Jurassic Park movie names. But nonetheless, Jurassic World Rebirth is in theaters now, and you can celebrate that on your own can of Dr. Pepper. So as you're enjoying the sweet, succulent flavor of Dr. Pepper Blackberry or Dr. Pepper Blackberry Zero Sugar, those new flavor additions into the Dr. Pepper family, you can do so with those great Jurassic World Rebirth themed cans on shelves everywhere, including at your local Kroger. So make sure you check that out today. And of course, we love having Dr. Pepper as a part of DawgNation Daily. And as we wrap up here today, let's give a golden shoe. I mentioned our DawgNation Cruise family a little earlier in the show. We'll give a shout out to one of our DawgNation cruisers who, she says, this is Lynn Vietri, who writes in to say, "Hey, BA, your convincing ad read spots for Royal Caribbean every day have forced us back on Utopia of the Seas," which I love to hear because I do love Utopia of the Seas. Glad to see people having fun on that. She says, "I'm missing my DawgNation Cruise family, but I'm excited to set sail with our daughter." Boy, is there anything better than that? We talk about Utopia of the Seas and Royal Caribbean every single day, and we love the fact that people listen to us and hear that and want to be a part of what we're doing on that. So, Lynn, I hope you enjoy. Utopia of the Seas. Sailing with your daughter, always a great thing to be able to do. Of course, we'll see you back on a DawgNation cruise again very soon, too. And enjoy your golden shoe for today as well. Lousy, stinking Gators, about 1,705 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Brayden Pest Management. We will look forward to talking to you then. All right, great stuff there. Glad to have you with us and on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work as promised, the price as promised. You can trust them on all of that today. I still sort of feel like I'm sitting in orbit right now, like I'm, a SpaceX, I just feel like I'm just in the sky here. Maybe I'm not, but it feels like I am. We'll get a couple of comments here and see how people are doing. Let me check in on YouTube, and then we'll bounce around the various comment sections. Thought good stuff on the show today. All of that on the table for you here right now. So Jay Shipes puts a comment in. Most of this I can't read, but I will get to the part that we can discuss, which is he says that there's a certain sort of AstroTurf feel to a lot of the discussion around the Big Ten. I believe that's true. And here's the one thing I feel like I notice is that you see, and we're a show that does this, you see pro SEC content and you see anti-SEC content. Joel Klatt, Danny Cannell, we don't dislike those guys necessarily. A list like the one we just mentioned, obviously the kind of, it's sort of designed to kind of generate the most chatter. SEC rivalries being ranked a little bit lower obviously helps create that. It's sort of a paint by numbers approach. You can see it, coming from a mile away. So you see pro SEC content, you see anti-SEC content. Let me tell you, though, the dog that doesn't bark, and this is always really interesting to me. There is not a huge market for pro content, favorable content, celebrating any other league, including the Big Ten, who does have big fan bases, large alumni bases. The Big Ten is a little, and this is why there's a little bit of a pro Big Ten bent to the media. The Big Ten's a little closer to cities. Most of the divide around, like, say, college sports and pro sports, or the divide that exists within college sports, is sort of the same divide that divides a lot of American life. It's urban versus rural. That's a lot of what this is. College football is a pretty rural-based sport. Media is very urban-based, closer to cities. The Big Ten exists a little closer to cities, a little bit more of a population center-based league. The SEC is Athens, Georgia, Starkville, Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi, Auburn, Alabama. These are not population centers. They're not. Athens is not even one of the bigger towns in Georgia. SEC towns are not population centers. And so there's always going to be a little bit of a thing in the media around that, because the permanent revolution of the media is the rural purge. That's just what it is. And so if you sort of detect, there's a little weirdness here. What is that weirdness? I think some of it relates back to that. Let us see what else. Jonathan Aaron says, do you think that Mel Tucker will get back into coaching? I don't know. I feel like there's a lot about that situation at Michigan State that I don't feel like I completely understand. I am not going to talk about any of it, but I always thought that story was, I don't know, something about that seems strange to me. But I'm also 1,000 miles away and perhaps poorly informed. Angela Smith says, will SEC media days be televised? Yeah, we'll obviously have lots of video coverage for you. We're going to try to be, obviously live on the air, but then, throughout the day, we'll be throwing stuff up on the platforms. But, to give a free plug to a, outfit I don't work for, the SEC network will do a good job with this. They'll be on essentially all day long, and they do really good media days coverage. So if you're at home, or if you're working from home, or if you happen to be off or something like that, just to turn on the SEC network and just sort of watch the whole thing, they do typically very good coverage for this. Jerry Marvin says the only SEC team that's kind of in a big city is Texas, and that's true. You go to Austin. We were there last October. It does not feel like any other SEC town. It's essentially a big city. It is, and that's not as big as, like, say, Houston, Dallas, but they're high-rise buildings, skyscraper type buildings. There's busy streets. Austin, Texas is a population center. It's also one of the fastest growing communities in the entire country, and it has been now for a good number of years. Austin feels very different than other SEC towns. And lo and behold, look at how Texas gets treated by the media in comparison to much of the rest of the SEC. And like I said, almost everything related to the sometimes divide we see in terms of how college football gets discussed, how college athletics gets treated by ESPN, almost all of it traces back to the just sort of urban versus rural distinction that sort of kind of defines what college athletics in America is. Because keep this in mind. What does Georgia have? The University of Georgia have 300-something thousand living alumni. Am I right about that? Does that sound like a right number to you? Maybe it's wrong. I think that's right. 300-something thousand living alumni. DawgNation's got like 500,000 Facebook followers. So we don't talk about numbers, but just as a simple for instance. So that just goes to show you there's a huge level of support for Georgia football SEC football that has nothing to do with graduating from the school, because oftentimes SEC graduates do go to live in these population centers. There's a huge collection. One of my favorite things to do is I hear from Georgia fans all the time that live in these very interesting cities. San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and there's major collection of SEC grads, Georgia grads, obviously, in these big cities. But as weird as it might sound, the thing that makes SEC football so popular is not necessarily the graduates from the school. If all college football was graduates of the school supporting their alma mater, the actual size of the sport and the fan base for the sport would be much smaller, much smaller. I mean, at least half of the big, like really ardent supporters of Georgia did not graduate from Georgia. In some cases, did not graduate from anywhere. They are people who live in rural communities similar to those around the outside edge of Athens and invisible to much of the national media. Jonathan Aaron says, when I went to Texas, did I buy a Keep Austin Weird shirt? No, I did not buy a Keep Austin Weird, but I do know their motto. I do know that. Let us see what else. Jeremy Harbin also mentioning Vanderbilt and Nashville. And I would say that Vanderbilt has had a hard time cashing in on the Nashville mystique for their own branding. Nashville's obviously one of the hottest cities in America. I'm not talking about weather-wise. I'm talking about it's just a major weekend destination. Every bachelorette party you've ever heard of is obviously, gone there. But to me, Vanderbilt does not feel very Nashville. Now that's also because, much like Atlanta has like every fan base represented in pretty strong numbers, Nashville has that just, in spades, right? I mean, there's so much other fandom other than Vanderbilt in Nashville. Much like Tech in Atlanta, Vandy's nowhere near the most popular team in Nashville. Nowhere near the most popular team. And not even second most popular, probably. And so I do think it would be interesting if Vanderbilt could conjure up a little bit more of the Nashville mystique into their own branding. It seems like they haven't successfully done that. KC calling for a 1,000-yard season from Bo Walker. Boy, wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? KC also mentioning Beck most likely to put up big numbers in the ACC. You could be right. Could very well be right. Let me tell you one thing I'm also watching for Carson this year. And listen, at Georgia last season, Carson was hurt by drops. That's true. But do you know, for a Miami team that's going to be one of the higher rated teams to begin the season, do you know that Miami is replacing its top 6 pass catchers from a year ago? Like, that's a lot. I mean, and for a Carson Beck who we're told is going to be healthy and ready to go for fall camp, let's see if that's true. But we're told that's the case. For a guy that's coming back to health, playing for a program, now he gets the benefit of playing an ACC schedule, and that's certainly to his benefit. But boy, replacing that many pass catchers is a pretty big deal. And also, and this is going to come across like sour grapes, I don't mean for it to. I mean, I actually have some pretty fond memories of some of Carson's moments as the Georgia quarterback. But his numbers through 2 years here were not that great. I mean, you can say last year, well, he was hurt by the drops, and he was. 2023, he only threw 24 touchdown passes. In the entire era of Kirby Smart, that's among the lowest single-season totals. I mean, the typical Georgia starting quarterback throws way more touchdowns than Beck threw for in 2023. For an offense, by the way, that scored 40 points per game, it just wasn't really Beck generated, at least in terms of the touchdowns. A year ago, he's 7.8 yards per attempt. That's not really good for really any team, and way below the typical standard for Georgia when it comes to that. I think Carson's a good player. I'm not saying that. And it's going to come across as sour grapes. I don't intend for it to, but I'm also not afraid of that criticism. We'll see if Carson Beck goes and lights the world on fire at Miami. He was supposed to light the world on fire here, and he just didn't. He just didn't. Brian Lindsay with kind of a funny play on words here on Facebook. Jacob O'Neill says, we know you'll be watching back. Yeah, I mean, I'll be watching. Listen, I love college football. I watch everybody play. I don't get the impression we're heading for one of these. You know, sports oftentimes is the conversation of comparisons. And when Justin Fields goes to Ohio State, that turns into a major comparison of, you know, what he was and what Georgia was without him. And ultimately that just got quieted down because, you know, Georgia won 2 national championships. And so all of that got completely erased. Nobody cared about that anymore. I don't get the impression that the vitriol around Beck going to Miami is anywhere near the same. I just don't. I don't get the impression that it is. I just don't. Ralph Price says, he says, I'm going on a Royal Caribbean cruise with my wife and family in about a month. And I don't even know the name of the ship. I'm just glad to be going. Well, Ralph, you're going to have a great time no matter what ship it is. But if you do think about it and you can figure out what the ship is, reach out to me and tell me about it, and I'll tell you all about that ship because I've been on a lot of these. So we'll try to set you up to have yourself a lot of fun on that ship. Let's see what else. Ryan Wilbanks says that he and his wife are going to be moving to the Tampa St. Pete area in a few months. Very excited about that. Well, listen, I'm excited for you. It's an area that a lot of people really love. A lot to do down there. Wonderful access to like beaches and things like that, which I really enjoy. There's also a Royal Caribbean cruise port right there in Tampa too. So, really good stuff. Gary Holt says, you think teams are going to stack the box on us and make Gunner beat us with his arm? I mean, I'm sure there will be some of that. It'd be nice to think the Georgia running game demands that kind of respect again. I think that'd be the case. This is a Georgia team, by the way, that's also kind of thrown it better than it's run it for a good number of years now, at least the last 4 years. We would say that Georgia's more successful through the air than it has been on the ground. Terry Westbury says, going in August on Utopia of the Seas. Terry, you're going to love it. I tell you, man, whether it be the 3-night, the 4-night, it's just a great getaway. Just super fun, super fun. The fact that Royal Caribbean is doing a ship of this magnitude for its shorter sailings, this is unheard of in the cruising industry going back, like, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. You just would not have seen a ship like this serving those who kind of wanted the shorter cruises, either the 3-night or the 4-night. You just wouldn't have seen this. But now that's kind of what Royal Caribbean sort of made its bread and butter. And people I just think they love it. I mean, the fact that it's very hard to book a stateroom on one of these ships kind of gives you an idea of that. Joseph Kennedy gives you a go Georgia Bulldogs, baby. Joseph, I love that. Kent Holcomb also brings up the offensive line. Big question for Georgia this year. It can only be answered by the play on the field. That's all. It can only be answered by the play on the field. But I think it can happen. I mean, look, I think it can happen. And I don't think it's some wild imagination. I mean, we've heard this from Cole Kubelik during the offseason. When healthy, he says he's seen Ernest Green play really good football. When healthy, he's seen Monroe Freeling play really good football. We believe that to begin the year, both Green and Freeling are healthy. And I know that at times last year, both guys sort of had their moments. I do get that. That kind of got them in the crosshairs with some fans. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. I understand that. But if you ask me, two guys that I feel really good about, Green and Freeling are still that for me. If they had, and thank God they didn't, but if they'd gone into the transfer portal, they would have had every school in America trying to get them. Every school in America trying to get them, because tackles of that level, of that potential, just don't go into the portal. So Georgia, I think, is still set up for a lot of really good success there. For as high a draft pick as Jared Wilson was, there are a lot of people who think that Drew Bobo can be just as good as him at center. And to have a veteran player like Micah Morris, perhaps being a guard, That's a guy that was here during the national championship era for Georgia. You love that. And I think if Daniel Calhoun does emerge as the other starter, I think he's going to make a lot of admirers for himself very fast. So, I don't deny it's where Georgia needs improvement. I don't deny that. I do believe it can happen. And I'm not just, at least I'm trying not to be, one who's just saying that as a way of, I guess, conjuring up positive aura here. I think it can be legitimately true. Garrison Tucker says, what running back is going to lead the SEC in yards in 2025? I think this is where you got to look back towards Texas again just a bit. Now, listen, I'd love for it to be Frazier or one of the Georgia backs. I'd love that. But this is where Texas, I think, thinks it can be stronger this year than last season. Baxter coming back from injury. What's the other guy's name? Is it Widener? Is that the guy that was like, that came on for them at the end of last year? Widener, I think his name is. Texas thinks it's pretty deep at running back. They're going to really try to lean on that running back position, and I think they can do it. The A&M running back's pretty good too. Shane Holiday, by the way, I love this from Shane, who says, I'm not going to book a cruise on a Royal Caribbean ship without the mason jar. He's a big fan of that. That has kind of turned into, and see, I'm like a lot of people in the fact that in my normal life, I don't get to go out much anymore. And I'm not saying this is like some sort of woe is me thing. I wouldn't trade my life with anybody, but I'm just in a little bit of a different stage. I've got kids now, and, we have all kinds of stuff going on the weekend. We'll wake up very early, most weekend days, obviously, wake up very early to do this job. And so the idea of like, I'm going to go hang out, listen to live music late into the night, I'm just not doing as much of that right now. But on a Royal Caribbean ship, that's my chance to really do that. And every night on the ship, it almost kind of becomes this sort of impromptu pub crawl where you kind of bounce from spot to spot to spot, and you listen to live music. You perhaps enjoy some of what the spot has to offer, some of the libations. And I'm with Shane. I am a massive fan of Mason Jar. It's a Southern-themed restaurant. It's also got a Southern-themed bar, really interesting bourbon selections, special kind of bourbon-themed cocktails, and they have a country music band that plays late into the night, and I love that. I love it. It's great. It's great. So, Shane, I'm right there with you on that. Senior Dog 54 mentioning some of the transfer stuff in high school. They're trying to crack down on that. I think it's hard to do, but they are trying to crack down on that. DT talking about what he likes about the Tampa St. Pete area. What they ever decided to do about the Rays Stadium? I know that they tore the roof off the place, and now they're doing something. At one point, they were talking about building a new stadium in a new location. Did they ever decide to do that or not? Is that something they're doing? Okay, so they're apparently still in limbo on that. By the way, our talkback is so loud. I got to figure out why that's coming through so loud. Let's see what else. Garrison Tucker says, Lexington, Kentucky, Starkville, Mississippi, opposite of Austin. Lexington as a town is probably bigger than you realize. Of the sort of legacy SEC, I'm talking about legacy SEC. SEC teams have been in the SEC my entire life. Lexington and Knoxville are probably the two biggest, probably, right? Is that probably true? Lexington's got a bigger population, you probably realize. I guess Nashville, though, would be bigger than that. Like I said, I don't always think of Vanderbilt and Nashville being that close connected, but it is their home. But Lexington as a town is a little bit bigger than you realize. But the fact that counts as big within the SEC gives you an idea of how small the SEC towns typically are. But yeah, Starkville. Starkville, there's just really nothing in Starkville. Nothing. You're close to, is it Greenville, Mississippi? I tell you what, people don't realize how close Starkville is to Tuscaloosa. Starkville and Tuscaloosa are about as close as the two SEC teams are to each other. You're really kind of right there. They're basically next door to each other. And there's not much in between the two schools. Garrison Tucker says, what's the greatest overall rivalry in all of sports? I mean, for me, I've always said this. I love the Egg Bowl, Ole Miss, Mississippi State. That's not what most people think of a good rivalry as being. They don't think of a rivalry that way. But I love the nastiness that exists because to me, this is where I think of rivalries different than the average person. Certainly the average person that would rank them for, an August body like the Athletic. I don't think rivalries need to be prestigious. In fact, I think rivalries are better when they're not. Because when you're the Egg Bowl, like oftentimes throughout history, the only thing the one side has is bragging rights over the other. It's like a famous line that somebody once used about why there's so much infighting within academia, that the reason why it's so nasty is because the stakes are so small. Somebody said that. It's a famous line. That's to me like what makes the Egg Bowl what it is. The reason why it's so nasty is because the stakes are so small. It's just all they have is being better than each other. And so therefore that's their whole universe. It's not prestigious at all. And so therefore it's just nasty. It's a little bit like watching, and I say this in great affection, I love it. I miss it on Thanksgiving nights. I think my son and I both would say it's one of our favorite Thanksgiving traditions is you like roll from dinner straight into the Egg Bowl, just as good as it gets. We don't have that in our lives right now because they're moving it to Black Friday or Saturday, whenever it is. But it's a little bit like watching like Jerry Springer or something like that, where these two feuding families are just going at each other, and I can't get enough of it. I said this during the regular show. Like I wish I was classier than I am sometimes. This is sort of an example of this is not classy, and the Egg Bowl ain't classy, but I love it. Brandon Griffin with a strong prediction saying that Tyler Atkinson is a dog. Kirby's not going to let him leave the state. I love that prediction from Brandon. DT says back in the day, BA in Vegas. Yeah, so there was a time when let's like pre-kids, I was living like a guy who had no children. That period of time may have extended a little too long. Perhaps it did, but yeah, pre-kid, I lived like someone who was pre-kid. Thankfully for me, those days are over because what I ultimately found was that was a much less meaningful existence than what I get a chance to enjoy right now. Bill Russell, by the way, good to see you, our buddy Bill Russell, who says they're talking about moving the baseball team to Jacksonville. Well, I'd love that. That'd be fun. Now, our friends who are just moving to Tampa, they may not be super, super happy about that, but that'd be really fun, especially if you put it in the right place. Of course, Bill's kind of a Jacksonville theme. He kind of lives in that Jacksonville area. UGA Marine says I'm the sort of classy that Ron Burgundy is, which is okay with us. Yeah, I'd say that's probably true. I am a sort of a Ron Burgundy style of classy. Leather-bound books. I don't know if our studio smells of rich mahogany, but I wish that it did. That's a good one. I wish that was the case. All right, let's get a couple of more, and we'll get ready to go. Bill Sanders says, do not sleep on the Ric Flair Dusty Rhodes rivalry. Yeah, I love that when I was a kid. And like, Bill, that's like right when I came into wrestling. Like right when I came in. Which, by the way, you want to hear something disappointing? And I think we may have a special guest coming up in a couple of days that I'm really excited about. But we got a chance, and it's just one of those things where like our studio is being used by something, and we had moving parts, and we had a chance to have Bill Goldberg on the show the other day. We just couldn't quite pull it all together in terms of everybody being here at the right time to record it. Goldberg's at his last match coming up. We had a chance to have Bill on the show and just kind of missed out on it. So I hate that. Maybe one of these days we'll do that. Obviously a super interesting guy to talk to. But speaking of wrestling, summer of 86 is when I got massively into wrestling. And that's back in the old like the real days of the Great American Bash. Like there's some Great American Bash that still exists now, but the real Great American Bash used to be like a tour that would go from like town to town, and you had Flair and Dusty wrestling all throughout that summer. That's when when I think about like, you know, like my sort of Sandlot summer, like these summers that just really were like super meaningful to you. Summer of '86 would have been one of those for me, for sure. '88, '89, kind of the same way. But that period of time, like say '86 through '89, those were my summers. Those were really, really my summers. And summer of '86 is when I became a wrestling fan. And Flair and Dusty was a part of that. Four Horsemen always jumping him from behind and just cheating. All right, let's see anything else before we go. Oh, Philip Jordan Wells also mentioning a huge rivalry between the Springfield Isotopes and the Shelbyvillians as a major rivalry, and indeed that's the case. There is a minor league team that uses the Isotopes as a name, right? I think that's the case. But yeah, Springfield and Shelbyville. Obviously, we saw that play out in the big monorail battle too, for sure. Philip Jordan Wells also mentioning Stone Cold versus Vince McMahon, which, by the way, a couple of years ago. So every now and then, you know, something like this, maybe this is one of those, maybe you sort of had to be there. But so I was watching WrestleMania a couple of years ago. My wife came into the room, and like this is when like Stone Cold made the special appearance. So those of you who follow wrestling know this. So he came out, special appearance, and he gave Vince McMahon the stunners. Poorly executed stunners, many of those were against Vince. But so he came out, stunned Vince, crowd went wild. But when my wife walked in, she was like, "Are they still feuding?" Which obviously had been going on for like 50 years at that point in time. No, not quite still, but just one of those things. Maybe you had to be there for that. All right. Jonathan Aaron says, is the Dusty Rhodes Hard Times promo the best of all time? Not only is it the best wrestling promo, it may be the best extemporaneous speech ever given. And I mean that sincerely. Spencer Clark says Missouri's kind of a dirty trick type team, very chippy. Yeah, they were kind of low key chippy, weren't they? They kind of were. It's one of those teams that didn't seem to be aware of how bad they were supposed to be. Like they sort of played ignorant of the fact they were not supposed to be very good. Because I'm just telling you right now, like and y'all know this, like I do this for a living. I'm very fortunate to be able to do it. I'm also like a diehard Georgia fan. Like I really want Georgia to win games. It's just my whole life has been, you know, closely connected to following Georgia football, my number one pastime. So I really want Georgia to win games. There's that feeling you go through during a game, especially in this era that Georgia loses so infrequently, where you do have to kind of transition from, you know, Georgia's not playing great today, this isn't very fun to watch, to the realization of, oh my gosh, they may lose. Like you have to like mentally get yourself to the point of Georgia may lose this game. And for me, that's even more difficult now because that also means I got to go talk about this during a post-game show. And there is nothing, I mean, like, I love my job. There is nothing worse than me being in a bad mood about Georgia losing, hearing from Georgia fans on the show who are fired up beyond belief about whatever went wrong, pointing finger in 1,000 directions. I love doing the job. I love all of you. I don't like that part of the job. I just don't. I'd call in sick if I could. And so you have to like mentally prepare yourself for Georgia's going to lose. That hurts my soul. I've got to go do a post-game show about Georgia losing, which is going to be so stressful. And that Missouri game in 2022, I'm just telling you right now, like I went from thinking that Georgia, to start the day, that Georgia might win by 50 points or something like that, and more worried about like where you're eating in Como than anything else, to what is happening here? And the stadium kept getting, I swear to you, over the course of the game, the stadium got more full. I just know that fans who were not there showed up during the game. They got loud. It was just really, really bad. Somehow, some way, Georgia figured out a way to get out of there. But Missouri gave Georgia a fight that day, for sure. DMart42 is challenging us to go to noon. I can't do that because I got to get the show ready for its other platforms. But we have certainly gone very long here. All right. Alan Hampton says no rivalry in sports compares to a good college football rivalry. I would agree with that. I would certainly agree with that. Anything else? All right, we got to go for now. Good stuff. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that, including on these very, very hot days, getting your air conditioning to factory fresh specs. They'll get it back for you. They'll keep you cool and comfortable and get some new life out of that old, tired air conditioning unit. So find them online, rsandrews.com, for more on that today. That's rsandrews.com. And by the way, if you've got a plumbing emergency, they can take care of that too. We'll see you back here tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Brayden Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then.